guys, this is our start of Unit 3, Populations. So first thing that we have to talk about with Unit 3 is we have to understand life history strategies. And in order to understand a strategy for a life history, we first are going to define what is life history. And life history is a series of events from birth through reproduction to death. So basically, how is an animal or a species born? How does it enter the adult phase where it can reproduce? And then we follow it through to its death. So, life history strategies are, and don't worry, there's no spot in your notes for this, okay? So just bear with me. They're going to be shaped by evolution. So how the species came through to be what they are today. It operates through natural selection. Okay, so one type of the species was determined to be more fit than another one, and it won out. It outcompeted the lesser fit animal. And then also we have to understand that every population has a life history strategy that's adapted to its environment. So because we understand this, that means that it is an evolutionary choice. Okay? So when we look at it, life history strategies influence growth rate of a population. And this includes, and this is your next box on your note sheet, the age of first reproduction. So how old is that organism whenever they are able to reproduce? Number of offspring, so how many offspring can that organism produce? And then the amount of parental care given to the offspring. Do we care for that offspring for an extended period of time, or do you basically just lay the eggs and you go about your business? And then finally, the energy cost of reproduction. Is it a costly event? Is it not a costly event? Think about a fly laying eggs versus a female human carrying a baby for 9 months. So whenever we think about those 4 life history strategies, we come up with 2 main strategies that emerge. The first is going to be R-selected, where you're going to put energy into reproduction and not survival. So let's have as many eggs or babies as possible and then not worry about what happens to them. They don't compete very well. Basically like to overwhelm it with numbers. They are opportunistic. They take advantage of favorable conditions or changes in the environment. Think about fruit flies here. You leave that banana out 1 too many days, and the fruit flies somehow just find it and lay their eggs, and all of a sudden you have a swarm of them in your kitchen. And then when favorable conditions are gone, the population that just exploded may crash. So it may just all of a sudden find that it doesn't have a food source anymore. So boop, there it goes. And then these populations go through irregular or unstable cycles. So up high, down low, up high, down low. So what are some characteristics of R strategists? They are normally small-bodied. They reproduce when they're young, have many offspring with a low survival rate. There's little to no prenate parental care, and they have that exponential growth. So if those conditions are favorable, boom, all of a sudden you have, many of these organisms. And they do like unpredictable environments because that gives them that advantage to reproduce fast and reproduce plentifully. And it is controlled by density independent factors. They exhibit that type 3 survivorship curve. And if you remember the survivorship curve, it's going to go from, you have a very low sloping curve. If you can see the mouse on the right hand side of the screen, it comes from 100% survival rate at birth, and then it severely drops before evening out. So what are some examples of these? Some examples are bacteria, algae, most annual plants, dandelions, most insects like cockroaches, rodents, and oysters. So now let's move on to our K-selected. They put energy into long-term survival, high parental care. And I like to think about K means care, high parental care. So K-selected care for their babies. They're good competitors. They thrive best in ecosystems with fairly constant environmental conditions. And they remain close to carrying capacity over long periods of time. So there's not a big ebb and flow to their population numbers. They don't spike and they don't drop drastically under normal conditions. So what are some characteristics? They're larger bodied. They reproduce later in life. Therefore, they have fewer offspring and most of them survive. And most of them survive due to that high parental care. They live in predictable environments and they're controlled by density-dependent factors. And these guys normally exhibit a type 1 survivorship curve. So that type 1 survivorship curve from the Bubble Lab, if you remember, we start high with a lot of people surviving for a long time, and then we slowly start to drop off as we get to that older age. So I'll show you again on the right-hand side with my little cursor. So we start high, we go over, and then we start to come down eventually. So, what are some examples? Humans, we are K-selected species. Large trees, okay, where they produce later in life, and even though they don't care for their offspring, they do tend to have a lot more of their offspring survive. Polar bears, elephants, most mammals, or birds. Right? So here we can see our different types. Okay, in the red we see a human baby growing into an adult woman, and then as we start to decline, that is the older part of our generation. In the middle is our type 2, and that's pretty much just even. You have equal die-off between babies, adolescents, and adults. And then finally, in the green, we see our type 3, and that's going to be our insects, our rodents, our oysters. They tend to think about reproduction, so they spend a lot of energy in producing as many eggs as possible, as many offspring as possible, and that's because they don't give parental care, little to none, and a lot of their young die off very quickly. So now that we've covered the differences between K and R selected species, and we've looked at survivorship curves, okay, I want to remind you guys that type 1 we can think of as being ourselves. We're type 1, we're humans, we're at the top of the food chain. And then 2 is in the middle, and then 3 is going to be on the bottom, so it curves towards the bottom, and those are going to be those species that tend to be, on the bottom. Rodents, cockroaches, they're always underfoot kind of thing. And for us to also cover generalist and specialist species, which brings back in from Unit 2, let's take a moment and think real quick between generalist and specialist species. Where do you think you would find a specialist species? So looking at the survivorship curve, I want you to go ahead and label, do you think a specialist species is going to be a type 1 or a type 3? If you said type 1, you're going to be correct. So if we wanted to put a label on specialist species, they tend to be advantaged in habitats that remain constant. So they don't like change. They're going to be type 1. They're going to care for their young. They're going to reproduce later in life. Okay. Versus generalist species, they tend to be advantaged in habitats that are changing. So generalist species are a type 3 survivorship curve. All right, so let me say this again. Specialist species, okay, they care for their young, so they are a K-selected species and a type 1 curve. Generalist species are an R-selected species and a type 3 curve. So I would go ahead and make a note on your note sheet and be able to go over generalist and specialist species, your K-selected, R-selected, and your 3 different types of survivorship curves. That's all for now.